Supply side economics under Reagan was a big success. Supply side economics under Biden is doomed to fail. The difference is fundamental. While using the same name, of course, kind of brings the illusion that it could be the same thing. It couldn't be far from the truth. The difference between today's supply side economics, the way, let's say, people like Janet Yellen and people in the Biden administration see it, is completely different than what happened in the 80s. And I think it's one of the uh, many marketing gimmicks that are being used by politicians. In this case, it's the Biden administration. This goes across the aisle. Politicians love to use gimmicks, but I just want to highlight in this episode the difference, because what happened under Reagan was actually very important and very good, and a good lesson for how to to manage a successful economy, because the U.S. came out of a very, very difficult period in the 1970s, and then under Reagan. And while Reagan has done many things wrong, I think this was definitely a good thing to free the economy from regulation, to free the economy from too much control and high taxes and all kinds of things. All of these things were very, very beneficial to the economy. The US won the Cold War in that period and also laid the foundation for unprecedented growth and innovation. Just to mention a few, the internet, cloud computing, and AI, some of the big developments that came out of that economic area. And while these things are certainly not directly correlated, there's definitely an impact that all this innovation that the successful supply side economics policies have led to the massive innovation. I want to highlight the differences and also highlight the danger that we see here at Orange Capital Partners with the current supply side economics, which is very different. This is Not Even Wrong podcast. It's September 9th, 2022. This is Krim Jelko. For the day, the fund is up 3%. The market's up 1.5%. For the year, we're down 25.2%. The market is down 14.5%. We are underperforming by 10.7%. Supply side economics under Reagan was the idea that you liberate the economy from the influence of government. Reagan famously said, people look for solutions at the government. So when they have problems, they look for solutions at the government, and very often the government is the problem. And I think this led to a policy that liberated the U.S. economy from all the shackles that government put on in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Today, we have supply side economics, and unfortunately, it's very different. In fact, it is increasing the shackles, it's increasing the involvement of government. What the supply side economics of today are trying to achieve is they're trying to provide supply where it's needed. So let's say examples like, we want to have more childcare in the US, so the government is going to provide that somehow by incentivizing private enterprise to provide childcare, or even just providing it itself. The government wants to have a decarbonized economy. The government offers subsidies and all kinds of stuff for people to build batteries. So that's the kind of supply side economics that we're seeing today. We at Orange Capital Partners are vehemently against that. We at Orange Capital Partners, we're Austrian economists. We have a view of the world that is very organic and natural. We believe in Popper as far as scientific progress is concerned, but also technological innovation and economic and any kind of evolution for that matter. So it's solving problems, creating new, better problems, solving problems. The government, unfortunately, cannot do that for one simple reason, that the errors that are made, they take way too long to be corrected. So while we assume, let's put all the corruption aside and all the gerrymandering and all that kind of stuff that the government does to keep power and to just serve themselves. I'm not even talking about that. I'm assuming good intentioned, smart bureaucrats that are actually trying to do something. But even if that was the case, even if they were good intentioned, they just can't compete with the private enterprise, the nature and forces of private enterprise, because the errors that are inevitably made just take way too long to be corrected, and very often are also way too expensive to be corrected. This is the fundamental problem. Versus when you have private enterprise, the path towards what kind of products and services to produce is goes through pricing. Pricing is the information the information that allocates the resources, particularly labor and capital, to whatever products and services are in demand. So this is fundamentally the difference. Now, I want to elaborate in particular why we think that the supply side economics that are currently being pursued by the Biden administration are doomed to fail. Because the government very often institutes, let's say they want to take an example, the Inflation Reduction Act, which is a terrible name, but let's just take it the way it is, wants to incentivize companies to build batteries in the United States because batteries are important for decarbonized energy infrastructure. Now, that's a good thing, of course, but we have, first and foremost, we have Tesla, which is already successfully building batteries and selling batteries at scale. So why do we need government subsidies for something where a private company is already commercially successfully producing all these things? So this leads me to believe that this whole section of the IRA is actually meant to hurt Tesla, or if not directly hurt Tesla, help competitors catch up with Tesla, which of course has nothing to do with supply side economics the way it's being sold to us. But more importantly, even if we again want to come back from all this like corruption stuff and just focus on good intentioned bureaucrats, the problem is always the same, that what we want, let's say we as a people, there are two fundamental problems, which is if the government, let's say in this case the Biden administration, does things in the name of this is what we want, well, the question is not really answered, or in other words, the question is, what is it actually we want? Do we really want a decarbonized economy? What does that actually mean? What does it mean to solve the climate problem? It means a lot of things to a lot of people. So that's why the government in itself, by just deciding to, let's say, supply the US now with batteries, or give companies incentives to build batteries, that in itself is not enough. It's not good, because we don't know exactly if that's what we want. And wouldn't it be better to have private enterprise and private initiative and people with skin in the game actually making decisions like entrepreneurs, and then deciding what they're going to do, because the chances that they're going to do better things that are more suited towards the current demands of society are much higher, if our goal is to maximize the welfare of society. So this is one reason. We don't actually know what's really, what is it we want. This idea that we all of a sudden want to save the planet, fine, maybe that's what we want, but then we also don't know exactly how, and this is the fundamental problem, and that's why we need private enterprise to find the most optimal way to the question of how. And there's a very good example, or there's many examples of when government intervenes and wants something, that often that something is wrong. One example I always put out is the DARPA challenge, where the government supposedly launched the self-driving car revolution. This is a perfect example of how actually government shouldn't be involved in technological developments, because just because the government wanted, back then, this was in the early 2000s, they wanted robots to be able to be sent to, let's say, Iraq and fight wars and things like that. So they created this self-driving car challenge, and lots of people got involved. Lots of people started developing software for that, and it was a fairly good success given where technology was. The problem was the technology, the stack was not ready for the kind of self-driving and the kind of self-supervised reinforcement learning that we can use today. In particular, the self-driving today is driven by cameras, and camera technology has improved dramatically, and computer vision has improved dramatically. And those two factors together were not available back then. So it was basically too early to really do that, because you needed certain the technology developments in the substack to be able to then successfully launch, let's say, self-driving car technology. So this, and then you have this whole generation now of people who work with sensor fusion and lidar and radar, and are still living in those DARPA challenge times, when in fact they could be advancing much faster. And then you have, human inertia and all that stuff which is holding them back. So this is just one example of how when technology is ready, it's ready, and when it's not ready, it's not ready. For example, when cloud computing started emerging out of the first internet bubble, and we had companies like Amazon implementing distributed computing and offering it as a service in a client model, in a demand model to the world, that was possible because the technology was ready. When NVIDIA was selling GPUs for machine learning and blockchain purposes, the technology was ready. It wasn't the government deciding, okay, now we want to have more GPUs because we need to do more matrix multiplication. NVIDIA was ready, the market was ready, everybody was ready, and that was the right time. So my point here is that very often private enterprise is better, simply for the reason that private enterprise is a lot better in finding the right technologies for the right time and innovating along an innovation stack which is necessary to provide certain products and services, versus government is a lot more top down. We want this right now. We want to have a decarbonized economy right now. Well, maybe it's too early for that, or maybe we need certain substacks. But I mean with substacks is certain other parts of the technology stack need to be developed first before we can go there. For example, we need to have better batteries and maybe better transmission technologies for electricity to have a fully decarbonized renewable grid, and then use that also to fuel electric cars. Maybe we need full self-driving cars to really replace gasoline cars, and we can't just put these mandates, we don't want to like California did, that we can't buy any more gasoline cars by 2035. Those are dangerous things, because again, the government, even if it's good intentions, could make mistakes, and then those mistakes, the correction of those mistakes would be very costly. So in other words, this supply side idea that we provide services because we want them. So the government wants more childcare because for whatever. By the way, that's another thing. Why is the foregone conclusion that we need more childcare? Well, maybe the Biden administration is dominated by the far left, which is very feminist, and the feminist groups want to have childcare so that women can go to work, which is fine. I'm actually very encouraged of that women can go to work. It's a good thing. It's good for pretty much anybody who can go and do gainful employment in a productive way and be independent and make their own money. That's great. But maybe childcare is something that is very expensive. And just by wanting it, or by the government deciding we want it, it's not gonna just happen, and somebody has to pay for it. And instead of imposing this on society, maybe private market initiatives would be better, where the pricing, which is always the main factor, pricing is the allocation of resources towards projects and stuff like that. So if we have the right pricing, if childcare is lucrative enough, we will have more of that. And maybe also another way to look at this problem of childcare is that childcare is expensive because it's not scalable. It takes people, and people are not scalable. You can't outsource childcare, at least not now, to technology or robots or something like that. So you need real people that take care of children, and you can't just scale up 10x or 100x the sort of care to children ratio. In other words, it is very it's one of those sectors that just has very limited productivity gains because it's very labor intensive. And now we have an economy which is growing leaps and bounds, particularly because of sectors that are actually scalable. High tech is one of them. And then you have this huge discrepancy that on the one hand you can get a mini computer called iPhone or a computer on wheels Tesla for relatively benign prices, or a Tesla costs you now $65,000. A decent preschool in big cities can be up to $50,000 a year. So it's almost a Tesla per year just to send your child to to something that resembles a school. It's not even a real school, these preschools. So that's, and it just keeps going. So having said that, we also have a trend globally that wealthy societies seem not to have kids. So there's a problem. And now, how do we solve that problem? That's a legitimate question. And I don't want to be political here. I don't care who takes care of children, if it's men or women or immigrants. We just have to find a way to solve this problem. And this is something that we believe has a lot more chance to be solved if we let the private sector do it, and the government takes its tentacles out of the thing, and also maybe incentivizes a few things here and there. But again, even incentives are government interventions. So it's better to let the market decide, just because the question of what is the right amount of childcare and how should it be done, it's just much better if people with skin in the game, entrepreneurs, take that problem into their own hands and hope to find a solution, than if we have the government just haphazardly deciding, okay, now this president wants X, and then it's just thrown out there. Now, we have successful models, particularly in Europe, where childcare works. But if you look at the cities, the countries that actually have successful childcare, almost all of them are incredibly wealthy and therefore can afford it. And that's of course one of the biggest problems, that we have very good childcare in the US too. It's just very expensive. And when something is priced like that, you would expect more supply. And the reason there's not more supply is that maybe even at these high prices, it's still not the right price. So having labor-intensive services such as childcare, healthcare, elderly care, those types of things are going to be more and more expensive. They're going to comprise more and more of the GDP, because the other parts, the tech-driven, scalable parts, software, and now even more and more physics, all of these things will shrink as part of the GDP, just because their cost structure is continuously coming down, while the childcare side of things will unfortunately become more and more expensive, and therefore solutions are still feasible. I think my suggestion here is let's consider the problem, and let's find ways to do it, but also let's take into account the most important thing, which I believe is that the reason the pricing is so high is fundamentally justified. And then we just have to accept it, or we can try to supply it. But if we try to supply it through government initiatives, the risk of error is very high, and then it takes time to correct errors, and then you have compound errors or technical debt and all that stuff. And all of these things could contribute to a much worse solution in the long term. And this is the one thing we want to highlight here. It's the same with other initiatives. The climate problem, for example, the climate problem in our view is a bad problem, because it's not clear what it is. And we like a lot more to talk about the decarbonization problem, because if we just define a problem like we want to use less carbon, we want to burn less carbon in order to generate electricity and provide transportation services, that's a problem we can solve. We can build innovation stacks around. Building innovation stacks around childcare is possible, but it's going to be more difficult. But if we have the government intervening, meddling around, then it's going to be much less likely that there is going to be a sustainable solution for the long term. And we're just going to have to deal with this all the time. So to summarize, the new supply side economics that are being propagated now by the Biden administration, in our view, it's not a good thing. It's a bad thing. It's a risk. It's not just a bad thing ideologically, but it's a risk. It's a risk for many things, for many reasons. And fundamentally, it's a risk because we run the risk, or we have this, risk is, I guess, the right word, where we start providing products and services and taxing people and spending, pooled government money into products and services that maybe aren't the right ones right now. And it would be much better to have the private sector, through piecemeal try and error, iteration, find the right level of products and services in the areas that we want, and maybe liberate the private sector from government interventions, deregulate. Another big example, of course, is housing, particularly in California. Way too much regulation. The problem is the government. It's not that the government should provide solutions. The government is the problem, particularly when it comes to housing. In many ways, sometimes housing is restricted by over regulation, and sometimes it's encouraged, such as, for example, when people are getting zoned to places where there's wildfires. That in itself is a risk, and that is also the government that is providing that. We haven't even spoken about the risk of corruption, which is part of government intervention. Is always, it comes with corruption, and corruption is something that we cannot eradicate from society, but if we let the government provide products and services, then the risk of corruption goes up a lot more. Therefore, at Orange Capital Partners, we're strong believers in the entrepreneurial spirit, the Popperian spirit of solving problems, having individuals, private initiative, people with skin in the game. This type of energy is a lot more successful when it comes to solving problems. Now, of course, there's a question, okay, how should we govern ourselves? And should we just let everybody be free for all, put up fences and take everything they can, and should this just become a sort of an elbowing society? No, it shouldn't. We're much better than that. We have technologies, moral technologies, ethical technologies, economic technologies, actual technologies. We have all of these things available to us. So we can organize ourselves. We can have governments that set the rules, that are arbiters. We can have judges, courts. We can use technology to enhance that, and we can punish people for doing the wrong thing. We can all do all these things, but fundamentally, when it comes to actual supply of products and services, we're much better off having private initiative do that than the government. Thank you.